Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab, sponsored by CPA Practice Advisor, with your hosts, Randy Johnston and Brian Tankersley.
Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab. I'm your host, Randy Johnston, with Brian Tankersley. We're coming to you live from Las Vegas at AICPA ENGAGE. Now, Brian and I today will actually produce a cryptocurrency and technology update together. So we're recording this early in the morning before we start. But we thought we'd give you a progress report on what we've learned at ENGAGE so far. Now, editor Isaac O'Banion has been roaming the floors. I actually did a video interview for him yesterday, but we've started the week with the CPA Practice Advisors Accounting Leaders Think Tank Symposium on Sunday, June 8th. We've recorded 2 other episodes for you on that topic. We encourage you to listen to those. But besides all the many insights, and we haven't even talked about 3 or 4 more topics that were discussed in that meeting, we then have met with associates in meetings over Sunday night through Monday and so forth. Of course, the opening keynotes with Mark Koziol as his first presentation as CEO was interesting. The economic insights that came. Gary Cohn, for example, from IBM, talked about quantum computing, setting up today's presentation beautifully for us. And of course, we spent time with a long-term friend of ours we won't disclose since we didn't ask him for this session, but I can tell you just over and over and over again, I've learned something new. But probably the biggest insight to start with is the vendor show floor is back with a vengeance. A couple of hundred vendors on the floor. By my count, only 2 are hosting services, and pretty much everything else seems to be some sort of an AI service. In 1040 work paper alone, Filed, who just took 17 million. Larry and his team were on the floor, talked to the Solomon folks, talked to the Black Ore folks, talked to the new Abacus folks who have a K1 product out of New York. So many, many things like that. But then also the tax research products are on the floor, Blue Jay and Tax GPT, portal products like Trust, and I can just keep going and going. The goal is not to tell you about any individual vendor. We do that in other technology labs. But to give you a sense that something is up and it's big. But the attitude and comfort level, and the word that I've settled on for this week is unsettled. So I've settled on unsettled, Brian, and you have observed a little bit of this too, but give our listeners, a little bit of insight on what users are experiencing and what they're telling us here at the show.
Well, we all know something big is going to happen with AI, but we don't know what it is. And it's everybody is talking about it and talking about agentic AI, and they're talking about new technologies. I think generally there is more investment in new software and new applications today than there has been at any other time I can think of in the accounting profession in my lifetime. Or at least one that I've experienced up close. And again, I've been watching accounting technology pretty heavily for about the last 25 years, but in particular for the last 20. And I will just say that, I'm sure that there was a lot pre-Y2K, there were other boom periods, but there are so many startups, and they're going at so many different problems in so many inventive ways. It is a great time to be alive and be working in the world of accounting technology.
Well, one of the thought leaders that I had a discussion with at the invited thought leaders reception by the AICPA, she basically said, there's so many vendors on the floor, I don't even know their names. And she said, you probably, how many did you not know? And I said, well, I'm fortunate. I I think I've talked to most, and I do recognize the names, and I know most of the people at the companies, which is part of what we try to do for you in the accounting technology lab. But she said, I think I know less than a third out there. Now the bigs were there, and they had big names there. So Walters Kluwer, the top people in tax were, in the booth. I mean, we're talking the big dogs were in the house, and it was
Yeah,
fascinating to
Kathy
see.
Rowe from Wolters Kluwer was there, and it doesn't get much higher than Kathy Rowe and Wolters Kluwer.
That's right. And, Gus from Iris, the CEO, is here. And Brian and I have talked to you about that in the past where, we had not seen Gus at this point. But Mike Sabatis, who many of you know from his CCH day, who's, on the Caseware board, is
Dave,
in the house.
Dave Weil from Thomson Reuters that did SurePrep is here. Uh, Jeff Gramlich is here. I mean, it's
This
from
is
Validus. I mean, it's
this is the real deal. And,
yeah. This is the gathering of the rock stars, and so it's intro. This is one of the I can get more done in 30 minutes on that show floor than I can get done in a month of calling people trying to set up appointments from home.
So, again, we're not necessarily suggesting or trying to encourage that you should, attend, but we know that if you're trying to do things via video meetings, that's just not the same as pressing the flesh in these events. And we recognize it's time intensive and expensive, but repeatedly, and I think almost without exception, Brian, everyone that I've talked to, it's not like the pandemic frenzy when everybody was just glad to get out of the house. This is everybody's here. They know things are happening. They know they have to be here to learn about it. And the most common phrase that I've heard is, it's not the same as sitting in a Zoom meeting as being in this meeting. One of the thought leaders that we met on uh, Sunday walked up to me last night on the show floor on Monday, and he said, "Boy, that time you spent with us over lunch, just chit chatting." He said, and then again, I'm not trying to be self congratulating here. He said, "You know some serious stuff." He said, "I thought I was well informed, but wow." And I said, "Well, I just like coming and learning from people like you because I've already learned a bunch of things from you." And he went on then as to why he was glad he'd made the trip just for the Sunday meeting for the Think Tank Symposium, but he'd already gotten enough benefit from Sunday and Monday to justify the whole trip. And I've heard that repeatedly this year too. And there are just little nuances that are said in it's just the little nuggets that you can take away. So, our goal when we do the accounting technology lab with you is to give you a nugget to take away. Now, if we start going down the vendors, if you will, we can talk about the providers to the profession. And I believe that we'll be able to give you additional insights on this offering, this person, and so forth, and what they're thinking about. But again, we want to honor the non disclosures. We do have some of those in force, but we also want to give you enough that you can maneuver. And we know that listening to attendees like you as listeners, one in particular that has attended here for some time said, I couldn't find your session in the app. When is it? And he said, every year I walk away from your session with two or three things that I want action because you've been pretty good at calling them right. Well, those type of conversations, happen, but I started walking away and he runs after me literally and says, I've got this specific problem with my estate and trust clients. Do you have a solution? And I said, yeah, just a minute. I think so. And I gave him that solution. And he said, are they here on the show floor? And I said, no, not to my knowledge. And I had walked the whole floor, but he found a tool that he could add to his tech stack. And that's really what I'm trying to say with this rant. There are tools that you need, but fewer tools are better than more tools. But we want you to have the right tools to satisfy your client needs. So much like Mark Cozio said last night, I said I'd not pontificate, and here I've pontificated.
Oh, come on now. But I would say that I think that I think that it's interesting watching the shift. You know, we've seen a number of generational shifts where people announce their retirements and they decide that they're changing. We have people that are just that are striking out on their own after long relationships with organizations, and it's always interesting having those conversations with people about what they're doing and why and things, because this profession is not going anywhere. I mean, we're going places, but this profession is going to be around for a very, very long time. And it I feel very almost the same way I did at the beginning of my career when I saw how computerization was going to change accounting, and how when we went to paperless, that was going to have a huge impact. And then when we moved to audit workflow automation, that was going to have a huge impact. You can see these things coming, and it's very interesting to be able to talk to the people that are making things happen in those spaces, and to understand their why, and to understand the why behind the products. Because the thing I would say here is there are more products in here than there have ever been. And so the problem is it's not about getting a product. Okay, it's about getting the right product that works for you and the way you work. Okay, I say many times when we're talking about accounting technology, it's very much like dating. If you want to date the beautiful cheerleader, that's great, but you got to understand that you're going to spend a lot of time at the gym and a lot of time at high school football games for the rest of your life, as long as you're with that person. Okay, and if that's not what makes you happy, then maybe that's not the right person for you. And that's the hard part about these things, is that this process of dating that we do to figure out what we like, what we don't like about people and things like that. I think the accounting technology space is very opaque in many ways. And what Randy and I are try to do in the accounting technology lab is we try to kind of give you some insight into what those whys that we learn are related to the products and related to the solutions, and what the thinking is from these really, really smart people that are out here in the accounting profession. uh, because it is a scary time right now. There is a lot of change in the air,
Well,
and you know
sorry.
we have to adapt to it, because the only constant really is change.
Yeah. So, two observations for you, our friends and listeners. First, one of my favorite repeated phrases of the event so far is, you know, that hosted cloud computing thing, not a big deal. Cloud computing was just kind of a myth. And that was so fascinating to hear because, for a while it was cloud, 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 everything. And now people are looking back and saying, you know, cloud was important, but not that important in the long arc of time. That was kind of an interesting, and multiple people, unprompted, said that to me. Second, I watched an attendee, a practitioner like you, who was talking to a vendor saying, what do you do? Well, we do multi entity, general ledger accounting. And the person said, well, yeah, I don't think I need that. And the vendor said, well, what it does is, allows multiple businesses to be consolidated and rolled up. And so, with a good explanation, better than what I just did. And the person said, yeah, we don't do any of that. And the person who was obviously the partner said, I kind of think you do. And you watched the person who was doing the accounting say, oh, yeah, maybe I do in that situation. And it got even worse because unfortunately the person was using QuickBooks Desktop. And
which in no way, shape, or form does multi-entity accounting.
and
In no nation does it do multi-entity. There is no intercompany. There is, it is multi-entity. Like I am an exotic dancer. I mean, they're just not. There's no part of it that's the same.
And I was watching the vendor being very polite, saying, well, we think that you may have some needs like that. And of course, the partner saying, oh, yeah, we definitely do. And the person's still saying, well, I don't understand. But they did at least gather the information and walk away. And I'm hopeful that that person will come back because I was standing there trying to bite my tongue because it's like, no, 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 you don't get it. This, it's going to solve exactly what you just said your problem was that can't be solved on the platform you're using. But I just
And
kind of bit the tongue.
I will say that this is a significant challenge for many people in the accounting profession is to remain teachable. I think we're so used to, one of the characteristics I've seen of many accounting professionals that holds them up in advisory is that they don't want to go into a meeting where they don't know the right answer walking in. Okay. And the thing I would say is if you're going into a meeting and you already know the outcome of the meeting, why are you having the meeting if you're not going to listen? I think it's instructive that I think we have to acknowledge that we are all teachers and learners, and we have to make sure we remain teachable in things, and we don't get so set in our ways that we just like this person did, ignore ignore this because they thought they knew what they were going to do and they weren't willing to consider a new solution for that because they were comfortable. I think
Yeah.
we've got to all understand that we have to remain teachable, and we have to understand that sometimes a nugget like that one you were talking about, I remember being there with you when it happened. And sometimes a nugget will fall out of the sky, and we have to consider it and make ourselves and take a chance and see if it will do this, and be willing to learn and willing to also teach at the same time. And I think it's, I think the biggest problem for the accounting profession is we like this stability. And I think the thing I love about coming to events like this is that I get to talk to a lot of interesting people doing interesting things, making a huge difference in the profession. And I get to understand the why instead of just the what and the how much. Okay. And the why makes it much easier for me to really get the whole picture, I think. And again, that requires us to talk to people and see what they're thinking. And sometimes it's a complete bust, but sometimes something magic happens, and something, and a solution is out here that solves all kinds of problems. But I'm not thinking about it because they didn't have a huge ad in accounting today.
Yeah. Well, one other observation, not that many years ago, many of the vendors were financial reporting tools. And, as CAS was expanding, and you and I are tracking not dozens, but over 100 financial reporting tools. And there are very few financial reporting tools on the floor. I was just thinking about the trends where we had dozens and dozens of financial reporting tools on the floor 5, 6 years ago. There's only a very few this time. So those type of things you have to, step back and say, wonder what's going on and why that's the case. But, our job is to kind of get you to think, why is that the case? So, Brian, any other parting thoughts here on what we've seen so far with this year's AICPA Engage?
Well, the profession is changing, and the environment we work in is changing. And it's not going to be the same in 10 or 15 years. Okay. But it's always been different, when we go through a generation of time like that. And so we have to, you know, we have to take time to learn where things are going and learn what the opportunities are so that we can effectively lead our firms, our careers, and our profession forward. And we have to remain teachable and to, again, be able to handle the, you know, the onslaught of change that's coming, because it is going to go faster and become more and more merciless as time goes on. And if we don't have the background and we don't have the foundation, we're gonna be left behind. And so we have to keep reinforcing that foundation so that our house survives.
Well, a fascinating show that we're attending. We hope you've got a couple of insights from it. And we'll see you again as you listen in on another Accounting Technology Lab. All the best to you. Good day.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. We'll be back next Saturday with a new episode of the Technology Lab from CPA Practice Advisor. Have a great week.